The Nintendo Switch 2 is no longer the fastest selling video game hardware ever after being on the market for 7 months. That's right folks, the Switch 2 is officially falling behind the sales of the Game Boy Advance, and frankly it's not that surprising considering just how much the hype has collapsed for the Switch 2 over the last couple of months. Now this information was just released this morning by Circana. They released their December video game industry sales data, and there is a ton to unpack here, but the best part is that this was the last piece of evidence that we needed to prove that the biggest problem with the Switch 2 is the one that you guys have been saying all along, and that is the price. So today let's dive in and figure out what is going on with the Switch 2 and the rest of the video game industry. But first, what's going on guys? Cheers. Now real quick, I just gotta thank everybody who's been liking the videos and using the new hype feature, because we ended 2025 with a bang, and I could not have done it without all of you liking the videos and using the hype feature. So thank you. All right folks, let's jump right in here and take a look at the data that was just revealed by Matt Piscatella from Circana that he shared exclusively on Blue Sky. I don't know, he doesn't use Twitter, I guess, I don't know, but this is the December 2025 US video game market highlights thread, and this was highly anticipated data because, as you guys know, the November data was absolutely abysmal, not just for the Switch 2, that was the primary thing everyone talked about, but like the entire video game market had a horrible November, the worst one since like 1995 or something. So everyone was curious, myself included, if December 2025 was going to be as cataclysmic as the November was. And luckily for the video game industry, we do see a little bit of an uptick in spending, but I'm going to give you guys a little bit of a spoiler alert. Okay, later in this video we're going to compare the video game industry in 2025 to that of 2024 and that of 2023, and you're going to see that the trend is let's just say it's still kind of cooked. Okay, so a lot of people are going to look at some of these numbers and be like, wow, everything's so good, and it's like, yeah, if we look at it in a vacuum, this is great, but unfortunately in reality things are still looking pretty bad. So if we take a look at the total video game sales, which by the way is in millions, okay, so 7,566 million, okay, so it's 7.5 billion dollars for the total video game sales of December 2024. Compare that to December of 2025, this is the data that comes out today. We see total video game sales increased by 3% up to 7.765 billion US dollars. Okay, so a very slight marginal increase in the total gaming market, which frankly I feel like is kind of surprising considering that this is the launch year of a brand new Nintendo console. We've been waiting like 8 years for this thing, and you would expect that the holiday sales would explode for the Switch 2, which by the way was apparently the best-selling console of December 2025. Okay, so let me just get that out of the way. We are going to cover that in this video, but moving on, we see the video game content data. This is physical and digital full game sales, DLC, microtransactions, and subscription consumer spending across console, cloud, mobile, portable, PC, and VR. Okay, some people still use VR headsets apparently, but here we could see that a vast majority of the total video game sales came in the form of this content. Okay, so games, DLC, microtransactions, subscriptions. All right, that is 5.75 billion US dollars in 2024, and this year it is 5.9 billion. Okay, so once again we see a 3% increase in the content spending year over year. If we look at hardware, now this would be video game consoles, right? So the Switch 2, the first Switch, PS5, Xbox, NEX Playground is in there I believe, but here you could see in December 2024 video game hardware spending was 1.1 billion US dollars, and now we are at 1.2 billion US dollars, so up 6%. And there's a massive reason for that, by the way. We'll talk about that later in the video. Here we could see video game accessories fell 7%. I don't think that is that surprising, but if we look year over year, okay, so the entirety of 2024 to the entirety of 2025, the total video game sales market increased by 1%. Yeah, went up by 1%. Video game hardware up 9%, but accessories down 7%. And frankly, I do think, again, I think this is kind of surprising. I mean, you guys can let me know in the comments what you think, but a 9% increase in video game hardware sales, I mean, I guess we can attribute that to the Switch 2, right? I mean, like, it's Nintendo's latest console, but I don't know. I feel like considering it's Nintendo's latest console and it's the most expensive console they've ever released, you would expect the dollar value to be a lot higher here. But anyway, let's take a closer look at some of this data here. Okay, here we can see a graph that Matt shared that shows the projected US total market spend for December. Okay, so it goes all the way back to December of 2019. Of course, we see a huge bump to 2020. Everyone knows why it shot up in 2020, right? And it kind of stayed there, and then we saw another pretty nice bump in 2023, and then a bit of a drop off in 2024. And we're going to take a closer look at some of this data later in the video, because I think this paints a bigger picture as to where we actually are when it comes to the video game industry as a whole. But let's take a look here. December 2025 top 20 best-selling premium games. This is US dollar sales, physical and digital, from digital sharing publishers, excluding add-ons. Okay, first of all, we do have one little asterisk here. Okay, sales of software packaged in a hardware bundle are not included in the best-selling sales charts. Okay, so you would expect Mario Kart World to be up here, and it is nowhere to be seen, folks. It is literally not in this list at all, and that's because everybody got Mario Kart World with the Mario Kart World bundle, which Nintendo foolishly discontinued recently, but that's a topic we covered in a previous video. But here you can see Call of Duty Black Ops 7 comes in at number 1. I wonder if we have Xbox Game Pass factored in here. I guess not, right? Because it's dollar sales, so I don't know. But either way, Black Ops 7 coming in at number 1, NBA 2K26 at number 2, Battlefield 6 at number 3, and we don't see our first Nintendo game until Legends ZA coming in at number 6. The asterisk shows that the digital sales were not included for this title, but at the top here it says full game digital from the Nintendo eShop is part of this ranking. So I don't know why they are contradicting themselves here, but let's just take them at face value and say that Legends ZA and all the other Nintendo stuff here, I guess, do not include digital sales, even though it says that it does up here. But either way, we do see Legends ZA was the best-selling Nintendo game for December, which I guess not that surprising, right? It's competing against Metroid Prime 4, which released to kind of quiet fanfare. I feel like some core fans enjoyed it, not that many people did otherwise. Donkey Kong Bonanza kind of surprising though, because this actually is a Switch 2 exclusive, right? So it jumped from 14 last month to 9 this month. Pretty cool stuff. We got Kirby Air Riders down here, Mario Galaxy 1 and 2. But let's move on to some more interesting information here. All right, regarding hardware, December hardware spending increased by 6% when compared to a year ago to 1.2 billion. Unit sales in the month fell by 8% versus December 2024, while the average sale price increased by 18%. Now we're going to elaborate on this further later in the video, because this is a huge point of contention. Okay, annual spending finished 9% ahead of a year ago at 5.4 billion. But what we can learn from this post here is that if you take a look at what was sold last year, okay, so we had the Switch 1, PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series. Those consoles sold more units last year than the Switch 2, Switch 1, PS5 and Xbox Series did this year by 8%, right? I mean, that's the only way to interpret this data. Unit sales from December of 2025 fell 8% compared to December of 2024. So the Switch 2 is the latest Nintendo console on the market, and we still see total unit sales for all consoles down by 8%. Now, Matt does not actually share Nintendo Switch 2 this year versus Nintendo Switch 1 last year. I think we all know why. Part of the reason is because we want to make sure Nintendo looks good. The other reason is because Circana sells this data, right? Like, that's their whole business model. In case you guys didn't know, Circana actually sells this very in-depth data. I believe it's very expensive, by the way, kind of like Sensor Tower for mobile games, right? I've actually reached out to Sensor Tower, and they're like, they sell their data for like $10,000 a month or something insane. I was like, okay, never mind, not interested. Okay, but anyway, I just find that interesting, right? We've got a brand new console on the market, and it still couldn't push unit sales above what they were last year across the board. Kind of nuts. Matt elaborates here, saying Nintendo Switch 2 led the hardware market in both unit and dollar sales during December and the 2025 year. Okay, so what we know now is that in November they got absolutely curb stomped by the PS5, right? The PS5 outsold the Switch 2 like 2-1. In December, however, the Switch 2 actually pulled ahead. Now, we don't have a ratio. Did it pull ahead 2-1? It definitely didn't, otherwise Matt would have said so. So we don't know by how much, but the Switch 2 was at least slightly ahead of the PS5 in December of 2025, helping offset year-on-year declines across other platforms, right? So PS5 coming in second place across both measures and time periods. So they're saying the PS5 this year in December sold worse than the PS5 last year in December. That's not a surprise at all. all. As the console gets older and as more and more people buy it, there's going to be a smaller demand for it because everyone already has one, right? Especially because it's the same price. We saw a price drop on the PS5, but it brought it from its increased price. Remember, they actually increased the price of the PS5 this year, and then the sale brought it back down to like what it was at launch, right? So it's the same price throughout all these years, and everyone's already got one. So of course the sales are going to go down here. Okay, but this is good news for the Switch. I'm going to give them that, right? Because if the Switch 2 lost in November and December, that would have just been like an actual embarrassment, right? Like that would have been shockingly bad. And truthfully, we know why the Switch 2 performed better in December than it did in November. We'll talk about that in just a minute, but it's like painfully obvious now to anybody who's been paying attention. Anyway, moving on here, we've got more Switch 2 information. It finished its 7th month in the market with a life-to-date US install base of 4.4 million units, nearly double the install base of the original Switch on a time-aligned basis. Right now, of course, 7 months into the Switch 1 life cycle, the Switch 1 had still not had its holiday bump, right? So of course it's still going to be far ahead of the Switch 1. Some context is important to understand the truth behind that data there, but here's a really interesting post that Matt shared afterwards. Switch 2 remains the fastest selling video game hardware platform in tracked history. Unit sales of Nintendo Switch 2 are 35% ahead of PS4 sales pace after 7 months on the market. Now, Matt was actually very quick to correct himself here shortly after. A lot of headlines actually missed this, maybe intentionally or otherwise, I don't know. But what he said was, please note this should read fastest selling video game console hardware platform. And that's because it is not the fastest selling hardware platform in history. Just straight up, the Game Boy Advance is the fastest selling hardware platform overall in the US after 7 months on the market. This is it, folks. The tides are officially starting to turn for the Switch 2. Now, anytime somebody says the Switch 2 is the fastest selling console, they now have to say that with an asterisk, right? That is true as long as you exclude handhelds. Okay, so now we have to exclude handhelds if we want to say that the Switch 2 is the fastest selling hardware platform, because it is no longer the case. Okay, the Game Boy Advance at 7 months in officially has surpassed the Switch 2 for the fastest selling hardware platform of all time. Okay, so it took 7 months. The first 7 months of the Switch 2 were fantastic. I think the Switch 2, realistically, when we look back on it in 1 or 2 years, I think what we're going to say is the Switch 2 was the best selling launch of any console ever, right? I think that's what the Switch 2 is going to be known for. I think as time goes on, if Nintendo doesn't lower the price, and if we still continue to see sort of lukewarm games throughout 2026, I think the lead that the Switch 2 has in the Switch 1 is probably going to continue to diminish, right? Because remember, this December data was the Hail Mary, right? Like this was the final frontier for the Switch 2 in its launch year, right, in 2025, and unit sales for all consoles were still down 8%, right? Now again, we don't know if technically Switch 2 sales were down compared to Switch 1 sales last year, but I'm going to be honest, guys, if the Switch 2 in December of 2025 dramatically outsold the Switch 1 in December of 2024, don't you think Matt would have said something? Don't you think Circana would have revealed something along those lines? Maybe like a Switch 2 outpaced Switch 1 last year by 20%, 30%, 50%, something like that, right? I mean, they never shy away of comparing the Switch 2 to the Switch 1, especially when it is a favorable outlook for the Switch 2. So frankly, I think if the Switch 2 outsold the Switch 1 by a tremendous margin comparing December this year to December last year, I think they probably would have said something. But again, that is technically just my speculation. We don't actually have the real data here, but I think if we use a little bit of context clues, I think we can arrive at what the truth probably is. I think Switch 2's December this year compared to Switch 1 December's last year, I bet the Switch 2 outpaced it marginally, right? Maybe by 5-10%, or maybe it's neck and neck, right? I think that could be the case, but really it also could be the case that it's down a little bit, right? Because unit sales for all consoles were down 8%. Now, we do know that the PS5 and Xbox had year-on-year declines, so the Switch 2 may have had a slight bump compared to Switch 1 last year to pull it up to only 8% down. Anyway, all of that to say, the Switch 2 is no longer the fastest video game hardware platform of all time. It is officially the Game Boy Advance now. And even if we scroll down here, we've got some people saying, I don't understand how the GBA is not a video game console hardware platform. Can you clarify it more? I'm sure my trusted GBA SP is hardware that plays video games. And of course, the answer is console, right? Of course, the Game Boy Advance is not technically a console. There is no console, right? It's a handheld, right? Which which technically the Switch 2 is a handheld as well, which I think it's completely fair to compare the Switch 1 and the Switch 2 to things like the 3DS and the Game Boy Advance and the Nintendo DS, right? I mean, they are all handhelds after all. Like, when I take my 3DS with me on the road, I put it in this gray bag back here. And likewise, when I take my Switch 2 on the road, I put it in that gray bag back there. It's the same thing. The advantage of the Switch, of course, is that you can plug it into a TV with official hardware. Anyway, Matt clarifies saying, yes, Game Boy Advance, 3DS, etc. are classified as portables. Hardware, yes, but not classified as a console. Thanks. I find it confusing, but now it's clear. And yeah, I think it's clear, right? If we're talking about hardware that plays video games, Switch 2 is no longer number one. If we're talking about hardware that is considered a console, Switch 2 is still number one for now. Maybe they'll lose that top spot soon. But now what I want to do is actually explore this data a little bit more so we can understand a more broad context of where the video game industry is right now, 7 months into the Switch 2's launch. Okay, so what I've done here is I've actually just grabbed Matt's own data. Okay, for December of 2023, we have the same 4 pieces of data that we just showed over here. So we have total video game sales, video game content, video game hardware, and video game accessories. So again, this is in millions of dollars. Okay, so 8.2 billion, 6.0 billion. And if we take a look at December of 2023 to December of 2024, and we reveal the percent change here, which is important to know, we'll see that total video game sales fell from December of 2023 to December of 2024 by 8.65%. Video game content fell by almost 5%, and hardware fell by 26.8%. An absolutely diabolical drop off here. It fell by over a quarter, right? It went from 1.5 billion to 1.1 billion, a massive decline in video game hardware sales, right? And I think that this is important context because then when you look at the 2024 to 2025 data and we reveal the percent change, this is all the stuff that Matt literally just shared. Okay, we see the total video game sales are up 2.6%, video game content up 3%, hardware up 6.16%, and accessories down 7.27%. Okay, so now when you look at this and you say, oh well, total video game sales are up and total game content is up and total game hardware is up, it's like, that's true, but if we compare 2025 to 2023, we see we're still down 6.24% for total video game sales, we're still down 2% for video game content, and we're still down 22.38% for video game hardware, right? So this is why sometimes it's interesting to sort of zoom out a little bit, right? I know on the channel a lot of times we'll talk about like week over week sales data or month over month sales data. Now let's talk about year over year sales data, right? I mean, why not? Let's paint a complete picture here. The video game market for December of 2025 is significantly worse than the video game market for December of 2023. Now, the other thing to remember here is that December of 2023 might have been the first time that a lot of people were able to get their hands on a PS5, right? Because the PS5 came out in 2020, but as you guys know, supply constraints persisted through like 2021 and even into 2022. So it may have taken a long time for people to actually adopt the PS5. And again, video game hardware, this includes all consoles, not just Nintendo. Okay, so that is definitely something to consider when we look at the hardware component of this. However, if we compare that to December of 2025, this is also the first December that everybody could get their hands on the Switch 2. I mean, there were no supply constraints. Everyone knows it. You could just walk into any store and buy a Switch 2 in December, and the price points aren't that different, right? The base model of the Switch 2 is $450 and the bundled consoles are $500. So really, when we're talking about hardware spending compared to 2024, yeah, we're up 6%. But in the grand scheme of things, video game hardware sales are significantly down still, even with Nintendo's latest and greatest console. Now, this is the part of the video where we talk about the fact that you guys were right all along, okay? Because if we take a look at what Matt said here, some people might find it surprising that the Nintendo Switch 2 led the hardware market in both unit and dollar sales, with PS5 coming in second place, right? If you remember back to the November data, the PS5 blew the Switch 2 out of the water, and going into December, the expectation was that maybe Nintendo will actually lose December, which historically they don't, right? Usually Sony wins November November, Nintendo wins December, and of course that trend continues this year. But what caused this disparity, right? How come nobody bought a Switch 2 in November and everyone bought the Switch 2 in December? Did people just wait? Did something magical happen? Well, the answer is yes. The price dropped for the Switch 2 in December. This is something that I have been drilling into you guys for the past couple of weeks. The retailers saw the data. The retailers saw that people were not buying the Switch 2 at 450 and 500, or at least they weren't buying them in the numbers that everybody expected, the numbers that the retailers expected, the numbers that Nintendo expected. And so on the very first day of December, which happened to be Cyber Monday, the price drops began, and they persisted for at least 10 days. I stopped tracking after that, and then they went away for a little bit, and then before Christmas they came back. And so for a majority of December's holiday sales, the Switch 2 was on sale at basically any retailer. Whether you went to Walmart or you went to Target, Best Buy, or whatever, if it wasn't on sale there, those retailers were price matching it. We even saw Micro Center near the end of the month actually just drop the price of the base model to $400. And this is what I meant earlier in the video when I said that this December data was the final piece to the puzzle. This was the last piece of evidence that we needed to know for certain that the problem with the Switch 2 sales has been the price, right? Fundamentally, there was no difference between holiday buying for Black Friday and holiday buying on Cyber Monday, right? They're like 3 days apart. Okay, what's the difference between the Switch 2 sales in November and the Switch 2 sales in December? Well, the Switch 2 won in December because the price was lower. I mean, I don't know how many more times we need evidence to support this, but like, if Nintendo wants to continue the momentum and hype for the Switch 2, we need one of two things to happen, preferably both. Okay, first of all, games. People will buy consoles even if they're expensive if there are fantastic exclusives on that console. And unfortunately for Nintendo, it looks like Legends EA was a hit, but they played it safe and released it on the Switch 1, right? So who knows how many units of the Switch 2 they could have moved if they made this a Switch 2 exclusive. That being said, I think them playing it safe was the right call, considering the Switch 2 is so expensive. They didn't want to bank on that. But if we don't have any games coming down the pipeline that are going to melt your face off, then we need to see a price drop. Like, we need to see an MSRP price drop from Nintendo themselves. Now, will they actually do this? I don't know, but if they look at this December data, I think it paints a pretty clear picture, right? I mean, when the price is lower, more people are willing to buy it by a pretty big margin, in fact, considering how much they lost to the PS5 in November, right? So really, I have no idea what Nintendo's game plan is going to be here, because as we talked about in my last video, Nintendo is kind of between a rock and a hard place when you look at tariffs, RAM prices, and everything else going on in the industry. Lots of analysts are saying that they need to raise the price, right? But here we have the data showing that the Switch 2 actually can outperform the PS5 if the price is lower. So now that we have this December sales data from Circana, the question becomes, did the Switch 2 have a better holiday season than the Switch 1 did in 2017? I mean, I think that's a fair question, right? We're comparing the Switch 2's first holiday season to the Switch 1's first holiday season. Which one sold more units? Well, great news. Even though Matt Piscatella doesn't actually share hard numbers with us, we can use a little bit of math and logic to arrive at a very reasonable conclusion, and the answer is the Switch 2 lost to the Switch 1 holiday seasons compared. How do we know that? Well, it's actually super simple. We know that in June of 2025, the Switch 2 sold about 1.6 million units in the US, and if we look at what Matt shared here from back in August, we know that the Switch 2 hit 2.4 million units sold life to date over its first 3 months. And if we compare that to today's data that Matt shared with us, we'll find that the Switch 2 now has a life to date US install base of 4.4 million units. Okay, so at the end of August, we were at 2.4. At the end of December, we are at 4.4. Okay, so that means 2 million Switch 2 units were sold in September, October, November, and December. So do we have any of those sales numbers? Well, in fact, we do. Circana shared the October sales numbers as well. As you can see here, Nintendo Switch 2 sold 328,000 units in the US in October. So all we need to know is September, November, and December. And one thing we do know from Circana, which by the way, I think they deleted this. Maybe I'm just struggling to find it, but it was archived by gamesindustry.biz. We can see here, and we actually did talk about this on the channel in the past, but Circana revealed that Nintendo Switch 2 combined with Nintendo Switch 1 sales fell by 10%. Okay, so we're comparing Switch 2 and Switch 1 in November of 2025 to just Switch 1 in November of 2024, and that combined sales was down by 10%, which means Switch 1 and Switch 2 sales for November of 2025 was probably between the 450,000 and 550,000 range. We're talking about units sold here. So then all we need to know is September and December, and frankly we know that September wasn't some outlier insanely good month, right? I mean, we didn't see any big releases that would sell the system because I mean Pokemon came out in October, right? And then that's when all the big releases came after Pokemon. So most likely September was between 330 and 420,000 units, which means the low end sales for December of 2025 was like 800,000 and the high end was 1 million. Okay, so that is the most logical conclusion to come to, unless you think September was some super outperforming month. So then if we look at November and December, we can be super generous, right? Like let's just say the Switch 2 sold 1 million this past December, and let's say it sold 550,000 in November. Those are kind of the high end of the ranges that I've provided you guys. That would mean that in holiday of 2025 the Switch 2 sold about 1.55 million units. So then the question becomes, how many Switch 1 units did they sell in holiday of 2017? And great news, one piece of data is absolutely certain, and that is that the Switch 1 sold 1.5 million units in December alone. It was also reported over on Nintendo Everything, by the way, December 2017 NPD. They go on to say Nintendo has shared new information about its sales performance ahead of the latest NPD report release later today. In the US last month, Switch sold more units than any other gaming system. 1.5 million units were sold during the 5-week reporting period of December. Nintendo also reiterates that Switch has sold more than 4.8 million units, making it the fastest selling home console in US history. Wow, it's almost like they're just copy and pasting the same marketing push for the Switch 1 to the Switch 2. And it actually worked, by the way. And if we use some clues from November of 2017 to figure out how many Switch units sold then, well, back then the Switch was the second best-selling console of November. The PS4 was actually number 1 in November of 2017. And we know that the total number of hardware units moved in 2017 for November was between 3.2 and 3.4 million. So that puts the Switch 2 between 660,000 and 825,000 units for November of 2017. But really, it almost doesn't even matter what the November sales data was for the Switch 1, because December alone is basically the high-end estimate of the Switch 2's entire holiday season, right? Realistically, the Switch 1 for holiday of 2017 sold between 2 and 2.3 million units. And while we did have to resort to using some data-driven estimates here, the numbers aren't even close, right? So whether we're off by 10 or 20%, it doesn't even matter, because no matter how you cut it, the Switch 1 definitely had a better holiday season than the Switch 2. There's literally zero evidence to support otherwise, unless Nintendo or Circana just releases that data for whatever reason. But I mean, really, people who can do math know that this is the case. I mean, it's so abundantly clear, it's not even close. The Switch 1 selling 1.5 million in December alone is just a mind-blowing number, right? You know it, I know it, everyone knows it. The Switch 2 was just not going to compete this holiday season, and so now we know that not only is the Switch 2 not the fastest selling video game hardware of all time, it's behind the Game Boy Advance, it also had a worse first holiday season than the Switch 1 did. So the trajectory of the Switch 2 is abundantly clear, at least here in the United States, and frankly there's no evidence to suggest that that's going to change anytime soon until Nintendo reveals some big game, unless maybe Duskbloods is going to do it, right? Maybe Duskbloods is going to be that game where basically everyone needs to play it. That's the game, you gotta buy the Switch 2 for Duskbloods and GG, and who knows, maybe that will be the case, and if it is, I'll let you know here on the channel. Anyway guys, if you made it to the end of the video, consider dropping a thumbs up on it. It really helps out the channel a ton, and you might think you're subscribed because you've seen a ton of my content, but you're actually not. Double check down below.